These are the materials you are going to need. So take a long look at this picture. Um, you need brushes, water, watercolor paint, a white crayon, a straw, pencil, plastic wrap, salt, paper towel, and of course your paper. So make sure on your paper you're going to use the rough side. So watercolor paper is a little thicker. You are then going to label. You are going to label your paper. So take a minute and pause this and make sure that you split up the paper and label what you see. Okay, now we're ready to start. Obviously, watercolor comes in many different things. We're going to use a dry watercolor palette, and we're going to start with the salt one first because it needs to be wet. So we're going to add some water to the dry pigment. You don't want it to be too dark with too much pigment, so you kind of have to experiment of getting out the pigment. You can see I'm using the top. That's your mixing tray, and you need to add water to it. You can always test it on your paper. This looks good. I'm going to add some water to it. With salt, you're going to find out, you're going to experiment here. It can't be too dry. Here you see you need to glisten, so it gets kind of shiny. So you don't want too much water and you don't want it too dry. Sprinkle the salt on and just leave it. Okay, it has to dry. We're going to move on. I'm going to get more color. Again, you're using your lid as a palette or a place to put your paint. Using the plastic, it does need to be wet. Again, not too wet, not too dry. With watercolor, the charm is you can mix it right on your paper, which is so much fun. So it just needs to be covered. Again, not too dry, not too wet. It should be glistening. Okay, so you can kind of hold it up to the light to check to see if it is wet enough. The darker you have it, the more the paint gets trapped, so it's really kind of up to you. You're going to take the tissue or the plastic and you're going to crinkle it. It's going to trap the paint underneath it when it dries, and it will be darker. So for this, nothing fancy. I just want you to crinkle it because this, I want you to see the effects. For the resist, you've probably did this in elementary school, but you're just going to take the crayon. You do have to push really hard to try to get the oil onto the paper. So water and oil do not mix. That's the charm of this one. So then wet some paint. You can mix it on your tray and put it on. If it's not moving, just get more paint or it needs more water. It doesn't have to be perfect. I just want you to see that you can use just a white crayon to get the effects that you want. Okay, so that's resist. We're resisting the watercolor with the oil and the crayon. Dry brush. You just need a bottom layer. So you can just lay it down and let it dry, and you can work on a different part while it's drying, and then the dry brush will go on top. All right, tissue. So again, you're going to have a wet bottom, and you're going to use the tissue to soak up some of that wet paint and leave the white of the paper. So just lay down some pigment. It needs to be wet, but not too wet. You're going to hear me say that over and over. You're going to find out kind of how to handle and manipulate watercolor during this tester. It should be glistening. Here you can see it. I can hold it up, and it's sort of shiny, right? If it's not shiny and it dried, because it does dry, just re-wet it. You do need to crinkle the tissue to try to pull it off. This would be great for water or for clouds. Okay, now we're going to dry brush. Now, this is tricky. So you want to dab it off. Mine is too nice, so it means it had too much water. There you can see the difference between it working and it not working. Too much water. It wasn't as successful. I just want you to try. So dry brush means that you're wiping off some of the pigment. You want to see through it. It shouldn't be a solid brush stroke. So the last two are fairly similar. We have the straw and we have the splatter. One side you're going to lay down a layer of wet pigment, and the other side is going to be the dry paper. And then you're going to add For the straw, you're going to add dabs of wet paint and then blow it and see what happens. What's the difference between what happens on a wet surface, the wet pigment with the wet pigment, and the wet pigment on a dry surface. So you can see I added a layer of yellow. And now here's the trick with the straw is you do have to dab the pigment, but the dots have to be wet enough or you can't move it with your straw. The straws are pretty small, so you got to get way down there and it should move. So on the dry side, you can see it's very controlled because the paper is stopping it. But on a wet surface, you can see it really kind of blends. Depending on what you're working on, this could be a positive and effect for you. Okay, last one is the splatter, which is really fun. If you wanted to, you could do other colors with the straw. Lots of times I have students who really love this one and they really want to experiment. So it's really kind of up to you. Again, the dots have to be wet enough or it won't move at all. Okay, so now is the fun part. I know we have the splatter part left to do, but it's really kind of fun to take a look at our plastic. It has to dry before you can move it, but at this point, here you can see it is dry. Whew, super fun. You can test it before you pull it off, just kind of peek on the corner, and if it moves around, you just gotta leave it, it's gotta dry. So splatter, you need a wet side, and then of course the dry side. So you're just gonna lay down some pigment. It cannot be too dark, and the color that you pick to splatter needs to be darker so that you can see it. Okay, that was one of the mistakes that I saw. You could just get a paintbrush or a toothbrush. The toothbrush is a little harder to control. You can see how messy it is here, but it's really kind of fun and it really spreads out more than it does with a paintbrush. So these are the effects that you need to experiment with. Have fun.